information about working with things in space, mental maps, things like that. Phonological loop, where we hold anything that we can recite in a sound-based code. So anything, typically we're talking about things that we can rehearse with language. And the episodic buffer, which allows us to make connection to long-term memory, because episodic memories are those memories that we have of our lives from our own perspective. Now, one thing we have learned from studying the brain is that the prefrontal cortex, right up here, prefrontal cortex is critical for successful use of working memory. Damage to the prefrontal cortex results in severe problems with working memory, and working memory is the memory you need to function right now. It's the memory that I'm using, the words I'm pulling up from my mental dictionary, everything I know about how to use English grammar, everything I know about what we talked about last time, everything I know about what I want to talk about today. I'm pulling all of that up onto my working memory. It's like the desktop for my current function. As we know, sometimes the desktop doesn't work. And the desktop won't work if we have problems with the prefrontal cortex. Now we know this because if we train animals to respond by choosing where they have seen a treat. So we say, all right, we're going to show you a treat, we're going to hide the treat, we're going to cover up the screen. Now you're going to have to sit there and think, hold in your mind, rehearse, 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 hold in your mind where you saw that treat. Now we're going to lift up the screen and give you a chance to choose, and you will, and monkeys with a normal functioning prefrontal cortex can do this, no problem. But monkeys with damage to the prefrontal cortex perform this task at no better than chance. They can't keep information in working memory effectively. And we see that in humans. When there's damage to the prefrontal cortex, people seem to really struggle with that central executive function. They have a hard time allocating resources effectively. They struggle to solve problems because they get distracted too easily, and they can't focus, and they can't rehearse. So they have a very hard time organizing their active working memory to accomplish tasks. Now, we see that there are particular neurons in the prefrontal cortex that respond while working memory is active. And so while you are rehearsing, these neurons are active. So for example, show a monkey a screen that has an X in the middle and a square, colored square in the corner. The monkey knows that that's a cue. The monkey knows that when it receives a trigger, it should move its eyes to that location. And so it holds its eyes here. We see a certain pattern of electrical activity. Then the cue disappears, and the monkey has to remember where they're supposed to look, where they're supposed to look, where they're supposed to look, where they're supposed to look. And when that happens, we see activity in the prefrontal cortex as the monkey tries to hold that information in memory. Then when the monkey receives the cue, the monkey moves his or her eyes to the location, showing that he or she remembers where they're supposed to look. When if we have monkeys who have been trained to do this task, and they receive damage to the prefrontal cortex, they perform this task at chance. So they can't do the necessary allocation of resources or hold things in memory because they don't appear to be able to rehearse effectively. If we look at humans, we can give humans working memory tasks. And we see that we use this queuing task, the pre-queuing task. We say, all right, I want you to look at this screen, And it's giving you a cue. Note this is called an endogenous cue. A lot of people miss that on the test, what an endogenous cue is. It's telling you what you're going to have to respond to in a minute. And it's telling you now you want to focus on this side of the screen. Then the screen goes blank. A test display shows up. And what people are supposed to do is indicate whether the red bars on the side of the screen that was cued are the same. So they have to remember what those things look like. This is visual spatial sketchpad stuff because they can't remember this in the phonological loop. And if we have people do this task, most people can do it. It's okay. And they don't have any trouble with it. When we do the same task but we throw in blue squares, even if we tell people to ignore the blue squares, we see a different pattern of response between people who have high working memory capacity and low working memory capacity. People who seem to have a lower working memory capacity struggle to ignore the blue squares. So people vary in terms of their working memory capacity, and this may be an artifact of some individual experience, including educational experience, may have to do with background, but people are able to build their working memory. So you can actually build your working memory, build your capacity, and gradually be better at tasks like this. You know, one of the best ways to develop your working memory capacity? Learn more languages. Speaking multiple languages, people who speak multiple languages tend to have much larger working memory capacity because they're often having to juggle dealing with two languages at the same time. And the practice of doing that on a regular basis exercises their working memory. So if you speak multiple languages, you may actually have a larger working memory capacity than people who are monolingual. And chances are you do. Okay, so let's talk about long-term memory now. So everybody knows this image, right? We're all good with sensory, short-term, long-term. Now we're going to start focusing up here, because we've said what we have to say about these two levels of memory. Now we're going to start focusing on long-term memory. How do we know that long-term memory and short-term memory are different? Well, we know that they have different duration, different capacity, and the primary form of coding in the two is different. So short-term memory lasts just a few seconds, can last maybe 30 seconds if you don't rehearse information. That kind of window of 7 to 30 seconds that Clive lives in, where he, as soon as he starts to answer a question, he's forgotten what it was he was even talking about. Long-term memory appears to be permanent. So you say, well, but I've forgotten things that I put in long-term memory. Like I study for a test, and then I come in and take the test, and I was sure I had stuff in long-term memory, but I couldn't find it when I took that test. I went back to my hometown, I hadn't been there in 10 years, and I had a hard time getting around because I couldn't remember what streets crossed over what streets, things like that. I would get lost more easily. Well, there is evidence that the information in long-term memory is still there. What's happened is you've lost the pathway to find it. You just forgot where you put it because it's been too long. You say, well, what about the stuff I just studied? Why am I unable to find that stuff? I mean, I just put it there. I should be able to find it. The problem is that you just put it there, and you haven't gone back to revisit it enough times for the pathway to it to be easy to find. So you know you have it somewhere, but you don't quite remember where you put it. You kind of threw it down. You walk into a room, you threw it down, and now you're like, I know I had it in here somewhere. And that's why you can't find it. But that doesn't mean that it's not still in there. And with additional practice, you may be able to, you're going to find it, you're going to try and put it someplace that's easier to remember, you'll be able to go back to it and get it more easily in the future. We know that short-term memory has a capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 items, roughly, and what items we're talking about depends on how successfully we're able to chunk information, so we can increase the capacity of short-term memory by using our top-down knowledge to chunk and create larger size items that hold more information that we can unpack automatically without having to think about those chunks. But long-term memory doesn't seem to have a limit. People can just stuff stuff in there for an entire lifetime, and they don't seem to max out the limit of what it is they can possibly know. We know that short-term memory does permit coding that's phonological, visual, and semantic, but the primary form of coding in short-term memory is phonological. It's sound-based. If you can't rehearse the information in a sound-based form, you're not going to be able to hold it in there for the longest time. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is very, very semantic. It's based on meaning. And if you want to hold something in long-term memory, you need to make it meaningful to you somehow. You need to make connections between things you already know and things that you want to know. Build those connections, weave them together, tell yourself a story that makes it make sense, and it will stay in long-term memory. We also know that there's a double dissociation between short-term and long-term memory. It's possible, for example, people like Clive Waring in HM, who was the patient who had his hippocampus and other parts of his brain removed to try and eliminate epileptic seizures, they have fine short-term memory, but their long-term memory is impaired. They don't seem to be able to form new long-term memories. People like KF have impaired short-term memory. They don't seem to be able to hold on to stuff that's happening right now, so you talk to them and they don't seem to respond, but they do seem to be able to craft new long-term memories, like learn things, learn skills, and also they can tell you things about what's going on or what happened at another point in time, even though at that moment they weren't able to tell you about what was happening. So we have a double dissociation, different parts of the brain damaged, resulting in the loss of short-term memory or the loss of long-term memory, and they can be lost independently. As we talked about on the first day, short-term memory also tends to be more accurate than long-term memory. And if you're trying to remember a phone number, you're not likely to make mistakes in remembering a 7 to 10 digit phone number if you're just trying to remember it for 10, 15, 20 seconds until you can dial it. You're probably not going to make mistakes. But because of consolidation, because at each stage we pare down what it is that we're going to keep. We pare down what it is we're going to connect to the next level. By the time we get to long-term memory, we've actually only saved a small fragment of what originally came in our sensory memory. And part of that is because what we're consolidating in this way is bottom-up information. And we're filling in these gaps that we're creating. We're filling them in with our top-down knowledge, what we expect. This is how multiple people can see the same crime and remember completely different things happening. And they're all sure they're telling you the truth because they see the event and they store different fragments of information and they fill in those gaps later on when they retrieve with what they expected to see. So long-term memory is actually all constructed to some degree. Whenever you retrieve information from long-term memory, part of what you're retrieving, and sometimes most of what you're retrieving, is stuff you made up. Not stuff that actually happened at a particular point in time. we're not very good at remembering specific details long term. We tend to remember kind of the general sense of what happened and fill in gaps with what we think should be in that scene at that time. Let's talk a little bit about the serial position curve. Last time we talked about proactive interference and retroactive interference. Remember that? Proactive interference and retroactive interference. How do they work again? Proactive interference is what? Reaching back into long-term memory. Proactive interference. Let's think about the word. Proactive. Old stuff gets in the way of new stuff. So every time, this is what I was worried about when I first got here. I was worried that I was having proactive interference because I had to change my password 2 days ago. And after you've used your password like 10 times a day for 3 or 4 months, the password just kind of flies out of your fingers into your keyboard, right? And then Georgia State says, hey, you need to change your password. It's a security risk. You're like, great, now I have to come up with another password that has 8 to 10 letters and a capital letter and a number and no special characters that I can actually remember. So my secret is, I was telling people in my other class, my secret is I give myself positive messages. Like, you are great! Exclamation point. You can do this! Exclamation point. Whatever. Or, you are number 1. You know, that's a figure. If you're going to type that thing in there 10 times a day, it might as well be something nice. You look great today. I mean, seriously, to me, that seems like a modern life hack. If you're going to type that thing in a bunch of times, you might as well, I mean, you wouldn't give yourself a password like, that makes you look bad. You know, you would never do that. You know, like, we already have enough negative messages in our head all the time. Why not positive messages? I am worthy of love. Whatever, you know, just make something up. That's nice. So I was like, wait, now what was the positive message I was trying to send myself again now for the next 4 months? And I'm sitting there typing, going, now so you're going really slow. And I'm like, okay. That's why my passwords are so long, because they're positive messages. I have to type along, like this whole sentence. So I'm like, okay. And after I typed it like 6 times, I'm like, okay, did I misremember it? Am I not remembering? Was it another password I was thinking of? And that's proactive interference. That's my old password getting in the way of my new password. Just so you know, it wasn't me mistyping my password. I double checked it when I went back to my office. My new password is currently ingrained. But proactive interference is when that old information gets in the way of you learning some new information. Retroactive interference is what? What's the opposite? That's when the interference works the other way, right? Where you have a hard time remembering something old because you've learned something new that's more familiar and easy to get to. So I get retroactive interference when I go back to my hometown because I have a hard time remembering how to drive around, even though I lived there for 19 years, because I've lived here for 16 years. Now, if you ask me to get around Atlanta, I'm like, good. 42 different peach trees? No problem. Streets that change name right in the middle? No problem. I got it. You know, I know where the one-way streets are. I can get all around downtown. Good. I go back to my hometown, much smaller place, and I'm like, okay, now where does this road go again? And I know my sister. My sister's living in the same place where I'm like, how do I get to my sister's house again? My dad moved since I left. How do I get to Dad's house again? I can't remember how to do it because all of my mental map for how to drive around for Boulder, Colorado has been replaced with Atlanta, Georgia. So that's retroactive interference. Both of those are important when we start talking about what's called the serial position curve. The serial position curve is an interesting way to document differences in short-term and long-term memory, as well as the importance of the roles of proactive and retroactive interference on our ability to remember things at different stages of consolidation. The serial position curve manifests when we ask subjects to memorize a list of items. So we say, all right, I'm going to show you a list of 20 items, and I'm going to show them to you in a particular order. Once the list is done, you will have to generate as many of the items from the list as you can. You're only going to get to see each item once, and then we're going to move on to the next item. And they're going to be presented at a fairly regular rate. And what happens is that when we have people recall items from the list, they're pretty good at recalling the very first item in the list. They're pretty good at it. But they lose items in the list as they move through. So the items that are 1 through 5 on the list, they do pretty well. And that's referred to as the primacy effect. The items that were presented first on the list tend to be remembered okay, pretty well. But as we move into items 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, performance drops horribly. Only about 20% of people, 20-25%, remember these items at all. As we move to the last 5 items on the list, performance goes up to the point that almost everybody remembers the last item and the second to last item, the third to last item on the list. This is referred to as the recency effect. The items that were presented most recently are remembered best. So how do we explain this in terms of a combination of short-term memory, long-term memory, proactive interference, and retroactive interference? Well, let's think about what's happening here. Where do you think items here at the end of the list are being stored? Short-term memory, right? And remember we said short-term memory is more accurate than long-term memory, right? Because it's right there, it's fresh. You're not having to really do anything with it. You're just saying the words to yourself over and over and over again. And so the recency effect can be explained in terms of short-term memory. It's also the case that you're going to, when you have been reciting these to yourself, there's nothing that comes up after them to overwrite them, right? They're the last things on the list, and then they go, okay, tell us what you saw. And you're like, good, write those down as fast as you can, right? Because they're right there in short-term memory, and if you can dump them, then you might have a chance of recalling some of these items. Now, how would people remember these items? They have to be in long-term memory. How do we put things in long-term memory? We do some kind of elaborative rehearsal. So people see the words at the beginning of the list, and they start to say them to themselves to try and remember them, right? And they say them to themselves, and they say them to themselves, and then more items start to come in, and they're like, I can't remember those. I'm going to keep reciting the ones that were at the beginning of the list. And they get overwhelmed. They're not able to keep reciting once we get into 7, 8, 9, 10 items. They can't hold all those there. They can't elaborate on all of those fast enough to get them transferred into long-term memory. So they just hold them. They get those 5 or 6 words into long-term memory, and then they just kind of fake it until they get here to the end to get the last set of items. So here in the middle, and to some degree here at the beginning, people are struggling with interference. These items that are at the beginning of the list have a lower performance than those items at the end because these items that come later interfere with them, right? People are trying to remember those items in the middle of the list, and it makes performance on these early items less effective. So there's retroactive interference of these items in the middle on the performance for those items at the beginning of the list. So we can explain the primacy effect in part because even though people are trying to put these in long-term memory, they're experiencing some retroactive interference from items in the middle of the list. Now, people are trying to remember these items, though, right? Those were the first items they saw. They're trying to maybe make a picture or do something to help them remember those items. And because they're working on these items, they're trying to get them into long-term memory. They're trying to elaborate on those items so that they can remember them for this task. These items are enforcing proactive interference on the items in the middle. So these items in the middle really don't have a chance because they're going to get retroactive interference from these items in short-term memory and proactive interference from the items that you're putting into long-term memory, so performance is going to be very poor. We just don't have, when you're getting things presented to you at a particularly quick rate, you just don't have time to do elaboration fast enough, so you'll just give up focusing on these items in the middle. You'll see them going by, but you won't be able to do anything with them because you'll be trying to do some elaboration to keep these in space. Question?
If one of the words in the middle had a particularly strong meaning for you,
right, you would have it, and that's why this performance is not zero. People don't totally miss the items in the middle. Just performance is much worse. People, if they're going to forget items, they're most likely to forget items that are from the middle of the list because of the combination of proactive and retroactive interference keeping them from remembering them. But you're right, that if there were words, like if one of the words on the list here was bulldog in the middle of the list, well, people from Georgia are going to have a different connection to that word than people from other states. People like me who do bulldog rescue are going to have even, if one of the words was purple, that's my favorite color, my house is purple. If one of the words was sushi, I love sushi, I have it at least once a week. So there would be things like that. But if one of the words was like meat, I don't really like meat. So I'd be like, yeah, I don't want to remember that word. Maybe when I had such a negative reaction, I would remember it. But if it was a boring word like grass, I don't care about grass that much. I don't really have any special connection to grass. Sand, dirt. I don't care about any of those things really. So I probably wouldn't have a very strong connection. So you're right. They're going to be, individual people are going to perform differently on the task due to their different personal connections. But that's why this isn't zero. It's not that people can't remember any of these items ever. It's that their performance is the worst because of interference. So the serial position curve is a combination of the primacy effect, which is weak long-term memory, from just people trying to do some elaborative rehearsal right there at the beginning. The recency effect, where performance is best, where people are able to hold the last few items in short-term memory and rehearse them just in time to be asked to report them, and then they can dump them. But their performance will still be much better. And then performance here in the middle, which is relatively poor, which reflects the combination of proactive and retroactive interference on people's memory for the list. Now, you would think, well, okay, if this is all happening because of short-term memory, we should be able to interfere with it by keeping people from rehearsing. And it's true. If we give people a list and we ask them, once they get to the end, okay, so the list is over, now we'd like you to count backwards from 100 by 3, and you have them do that for 30 seconds, this line is just flat. So we can make them, we can use articulatory suppression to wipe out their ability to remember those final items. So we can make the recency effect disappear through articulatory suppression, showing that it is an effect of short-term memory or working memory, but the primacy effect still remains. So the primacy effect, because you put those things in long-term memory, you don't even if you have to count backwards from 100, they're still in there strong enough that you'll be able to retrieve them when the retrieval cue is given. So let's break down long-term memory, because there's actually lots of different kinds of long-term memory. We've already talked about one of these kinds in class, but I want to help you categorize these things in a slightly more elaborate way. We're going to break down long-term memory into two types of memory: explicit memory and implicit memory. Explicit memory, or conscious memory, is the memory that you know you have. So you're aware of this knowledge. You know it, you know you should know it, you know you've seen it before, something. So this is stuff you know, stuff you can talk about. It's sometimes also referred to as declarative memory. Because you can declare what it is you know. The other type of memory, implicit memory, is not conscious. It's long-term memory that you may not be aware you have. I drive my students in psychology of language crazy because I keep telling them about things that they know, but they don't know they know them. They have to do with language. All the things you know about how language works. Some of it is explicit, the stuff you've been taught in English class. Some of it that you know that's explicit is actually wrong. Like, never end a sentence with a preposition. Really? A preposition is a perfectly good thing to end a sentence with. I just did. It's a preposition. Worked out just fine. Everybody understood me. There was no crisis of faith or anything like that. Right? So sometimes the things you know to be a fact are wrong.
Right.
But everybody knows, everybody who speaks English, knows that if I say a preposition is a perfectly good thing to end a sentence with, you understand it, you don't go, that was so terrible, I totally don't understand what you said, because you have all this implicit knowledge about how language works. Anybody in here play a musical instrument? What do you play?
Trumpet.
You play trumpet. What's the hardest song you play?
The hardest song that I play.
Yeah. Can you play any pieces from memory?
April's Pursuit.
Okay. Can you play from memory?
No.
Okay.
No,
What's the hardest song you can play from memory?
I don't know. I know all my scales.
You know all your scales? You can play all your scales from memory?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you please explain to me in words how to play the first 5 scales?
I can't.
You can't, but you said you know how to do it.
It's just automatic.
Okay. That's implicit memory. He knows, I mean, it's there, but he can't describe what it is that he knows. Okay? It's in there. He knows his hands will do it. When he puts the trumpet up and he has to play the scales, and someone says, play the first 5 scales, play my major scales, play the minor scales, he can do it, but he can't say, okay, so my lips have to do this, and my hands have to do this, and I have to do this much air pressure. Did I have? That's implicit knowledge. You say it's automatic. That's exactly right. Sometimes we can also think of the distinction between explicit and implicit knowledge is sometimes, like when you're learning to drive a car, you're having to think actively about, okay, I have to maintain my speed. I have to make sure that I use my mirrors. I have to make sure I, use my signal. I have to make sure that I, give enough room to change lanes. I have to make sure, I'm doing all this stuff, and you're consciously thinking about it. But the more you do it, what happens? It becomes automatic, and now you don't even think about all the things that you're doing anymore. So we can shift things from conscious knowledge to kind of unconscious knowledge with practice. And we shift things from being controlled processes to automatic processes. Let's talk about these different types of...
Would that be something similar to, like we say, walking?
Oh, yeah. Walking, we don't even think about that now.
We don't think about it, we just do it.
Like if you have to explain to somebody how to walk, you do it all the time. Walk across uneven surfaces. Like if you had to explain to somebody how to change the way they place their feet and how to shift their weight in order to walk across an uneven surface. I mean, tie your shoes. If I asked you to explain to somebody how to tie shoes in words, no hands. Now you know how to do it, right? But if you had to explain it, you're like, your hands start moving, right? Because the words, I mean, you can say, well, okay, and, you know, people make up little songs and stuff like that. Like, first you have to make a little, you know, hole for the rabbit to hide in, and then the rabbit runs around the hole, and then the rabbit goes through the hole, and you're like, you know, whatever, you're like making up these weird stories. But these are things that you just know how to do. You don't really know what it is you know. You'll know if it's not right, maybe, but you can't explain necessarily what it is that's not right. So we can divide explicit memory into two types of memory. Episodic memory, which we've already talked about, that memory for your life. The reason I have, everybody know, do you guys know what this is? Am I too much of a nerd?
Dr. Who.
It's a phone box, right? It's a British, but it's the TARDIS, right? It's the British phone box. What does he do in the TARDIS? What does Doctor Who do in the TARDIS? He travels through time. He's a Time Lord, right? I know, I'm a super nerd. You got it. So he travels through time. He's a Time Lord. And he can go anywhere in time, anywhere in space. And episodic memory you can think of as your own personal time travel. This is where you get to travel back and forth through your life. Okay? When you close your eyes and you think back to what you had for breakfast, or what you got for your last birthday, or that great trip you went on last summer, or that horrible teacher you had for 30 part 30. You're engaging in mental time travel through the time course of your life. And you are the only person who can travel in that ship. Okay, just like the doctor's the only one who can make the TARDIS work, you're the only one that can make your own mental time machine go to the places in your life, because you're the only one who lived those memories. Other people might have similar memories, but they will be from their own perspective in their own time machine. Now these are slightly different than semantic memories. Semantic memories are those memories of things that anybody can know. Who was the first president of the United States? What's the capital of Germany? You know, anything. These are just things that anybody can memorize. And if you think back to Clive Wearing, remember that he couldn't remember things from his life, right? He couldn't remember having seen doctors. He couldn't remember ever having a thought. He couldn't remember ever having a dream. Okay? Those are all episodic memories. But what he could remember were things like, when you're sick, you're supposed to see a doctor. When the doorbell rings, you're supposed to answer it. When women get married, they often change their name. These are just things that, facts that anybody can know, but they aren't connected to him in particular. So what he has lost in some ways is the ability to form new episodic memories. He knows he's married to his wife. He knows he loves her, but he doesn't remember seeing her. Every time she comes back, it's as if she's been gone for a long time, because he can't form those memories of seeing her. But he knows a fact, which is, I'm married to her and I love her. Other people can know those facts too, right? That he's married to her and that he loves her. So he has semantic knowledge and access to it to some degree, but he doesn't have episodic memories. He just knows general facts. I have kids. That's a piano, right? He knows those things. But when it comes to telling you about his own life, he doesn't remember. At least not from his own perspective.
Would you think sex would bring that memory back for him? If
I don't know. You know, if you had a memory of 7 to 30 seconds, I don't know if you would think about sex. I mean, I don't know. One could argue some people think about sex all the time, so it's probably always there. But, you know, I don't know. And I don't know how I would ask him that question. Because by the time I asked him that question, he would forget the question. So I don't know. And I don't know that I would be comfortable with checking with his wife on that issue. When you're having sex, does it seem like he remembers stuff? I mean, like,
I'm just saying, you know, if she performs sex, then he may bring back memory may.
She says, they get ready to have sex, and then he goes, what are you doing? What are you doing? If he closed his eyes, would he forget her? That would be bad. He wakes up, wait, oh, you're back again. I don't know. I don't know. I didn't think about that. Yeah.
If you were to ask him like very short and simple questions, but write them down first, do you think that that would improve like his ability to like answer them and remember what he's answering?
No, because he won't remember he doesn't remember the question from before. Because remember, short-term memory requires phonological loop, and he doesn't do that very well. He
But
doesn't
if you can
rehearse well.
see it on paper, like if you have a question written in front of him, as long as you keep it short and simple.
Maybe, could be. It's possible. He certainly can read music. So he can read, but the knowledge that you have about how to read music and the knowledge you have about how to read words, those things are all semantic, right? You learn those. Anybody can learn to read music.
But he's playing that music for longer than 30 seconds. When he was
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that he knows what he played a minute ago. He's just reading it out. His eyes are moving across the music, and his hands execute the commands, and then it's gone. If you ask him what he just played, he could probably play the same piece of music all day long and think he just played it for the first time.
That would probably be implicit for him, though, right?
Well, the ability to play, to make the transition from reading the music to his hands executing the movements on the piano keys would be implicit, because he is a master pianist. He was a concert director. He can play the piano extremely well. So that conversion is, but whether he would remember having played a piece at all is highly questionable. Now, Clive Wearing has a very similar memory loss to HM. And HM was shown to be able to create new implicit memories. So he could learn how to do tasks and not remember that he had ever learned how to do them. So it does seem to be possible for people to have lost their episodic memory but still be able to form new implicit memories. So that's possible. You can learn long-term memories, but if you rehearse, you don't remember rehearsing. To learn explicit memories, you actually have to intentionally rehearse to some degree. You have to know what you're doing and think about trying to learn it. But implicit memories are things that we may not even realize we're rehearsing. So, for example, we have three kinds of implicit memories up here. One is priming, one is procedural memory, and one is conditioning. Now, priming, the reason I put Silver Surfer up here, because I'm a geek, but also because priming is about going faster. When something is primed for you, you can get to it faster in your head than if it's not primed. So if I asked you to list 10 words that you know, what if I asked you to list 10 animals that you can think of, 10 different kinds of animals? I would bet money that more people than not would put bulldog on that list. Why? Because I just mentioned bulldog a little bit ago. It's primed for you. You just accessed it a little bit ago, so it's a little bit easier for you to find. Now, it doesn't mean that you are intentionally going, mark bulldog for easy access in the future. You know? Even though that would be a totally great thing for everybody to do, is bulldog house. But priming is just that connection that you experience things, you're more sensitive because of certain experiences. You've learned that there are certain probabilities of things co-occurring. And so I can probably prime you to say a particular word if I say peanut butter. Thank you. Jelly just kind of popped up, right? And part of that is that I can make jelly easier to get to. I can encourage you to think of the word jelly just by saying a word that commonly co-occurs with it. Yeah.
You just encouraged me to finish eating my peanut butter and jelly.
See? You're like, oh, I just remembered I was hungry. I better finish that. So, but priming is about making certain information that you have easier to access. And you might not have thought anything about the word jelly all day long, but I go peanut butter and all of a sudden jelly. I just made that jelly jump out. Okay? So that's priming. Priming is when we make certain information we have easier to get to. And you haven't necessarily in your life ever practiced consciously getting to the word jelly from the word peanut butter. But through a lifetime of experience, the connections you've established between those two words make it easier to get from one to the other. Procedural memory, put here 1, 2, 3. This is a Japanese character or a Chinese character for mouth. And the reason that I put this up here is because when you learn how to write characters, there's a stroke order. You write them with the lines in a particular way. And that's how you're supposed to do it. Everybody learns to write it the same way. It's an art form. If you change the order of the strokes, the characters don't look right. And so you have to do it that particular way. And you learn the order that you will write the strokes. So anything that you have to do by executing a series of skills in a row. Motor skills. Right? How many times have I walked? Walk, 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 walk. I've been walking a long time. Balancing a long time. I don't have to think about any of that. All of the things that have to happen in a row for me to walk successfully around the room. For Clyde Waring to play the piano, to convert that music on the page into actions of his fingers. He knows exactly what he needs to do. He knows the procedure, the mental procedure, the physical procedure. He knows what he has to do. Some people think of this as motor memory, knowing what steps you have to go through to get something done. And you may not even be aware of all the things that you're doing to get those things done. But you can still get them done because you have procedural memory. Now conditioning, we got our Will Press lever for food, right? Conditioning is where you learn to associate things that might not otherwise be associated. So you might be conditioned in a certain way that other people are not conditioned. So for some reason, dogs often seem conditioned. As soon as the lightning flashes, they run and hide. What have they learned? The lightning will flash. Lightning's not inherently scary. They don't run and hide when I flip the lights on and off. It's the light outside flashing means thunder is coming. The thunder is loud and thunder is scary. So the lightning flashes and the dog suddenly feels terror. Okay. Now originally, light flashing did not induce terror in the dog. And yet the dog has learned through personal experience that lightning flash is a clue that thunder is coming, and thunder is terrifying. So now lightning flashes, I feel terrified. So making those kinds of connections that come through classical conditioning or operant conditioning, reward and punishment, and you don't even have to consciously realize you're being rewarded. Did any of you guys ever watch The Office?
Yes.
Watch The Office? There's one scene where one of the guys is trying to condition the other guy, so every time he loads up his computer and it makes the Windows load up sound, he hands a mint to Dwight. He hands him a mint, and he like every time he loads up his computer, goes makes the Windows sound. He gives him a mint, and he does this like for a whole day, and then later and later at the end of the day, he loads up his computer, and Dwight just goes. And he's like, what, dude? What do you want? He's like, I don't know. All of a a sudden my mouth feels really dry. So he didn't even realize he was being conditioned to associate the sound of the computer with getting a mint. But his office mate was doing that to him on purpose all through the day. So you can use this to your advantage in long-term memory. Anybody here experience test anxiety? You're like, me! Okay, so you can condition yourself. Now, the thing is, if you sit down for a test, you start to feel all nervous, you get all anxious, makes it hard to concentrate, right? So what you want to do is you want to condition yourself to feel calm under a certain circumstance. So next time you're home and relaxed and feeling, good, comfortable, take a smell that you like, a cologne or a scented oil or a perfume, and smell it while you're feeling calm. Put it on your wrist. Smell it while you're feeling calm. You can teach yourself to feel calm when you smell that smell. And then, next time you have to take a test where you feel nervous, put that perfume or cologne or oil on, and when you start to feel stressed, smell it. And all of a sudden, your conditioning will calm you down. So you have to associate that smell with calm. And then when you want to feel calm, present yourself with the smell, and that implicit memory will kick in and you will feel better. Yeah.
Would that work for like a general anxiety disorder, do you think?
To some degree, sure. I mean, it even works with infants. So if you have a baby that cries and cries and cries anytime it's away from mom, put mom's deodorant or mom's perfume or something on the pillow. And the baby will sleep better because it smells like mom. Mom smells good. Put mom's t-shirt that mom was wearing today over the pillow and the baby will go out like a light because it smells like mom and mom is good. So if you're like, the smell of Starbucks makes me so happy. Well, what you want to do is get some coffee oil, right? Or if you're all about the vanilla latte, just get some vanilla, fresh vanilla, and put it on your real vanilla, not the artificial crap, that stuff's gross. And put it on. So I can just see the next test, long-term memory test. Everyone's going to be like, But, but remember, like if you do that, don't we don't want the room to smell like the Macy's perfume counter, right? Don't just like spray it all over. Like, I'm going to associate all the stuff in this glass with Axe body spray. Please, no. You want it to be something subtle and non-intrusive, right? But you can totally do it. And that also means that if you study with incense or something like that, then say you study with patchouli incense, because that's your thing. Get a little bit of patchouli oil and put it on your wrist, and it will actually help you remember things that you studied while you were smelling that smell. Because one of the strongest retrieval cues is smell. You ever walked into a place you haven't been for a long time and it just has this smell and all of a sudden your brain is flooded with memories? Grandma's house. There's nothing, you walk into Grandma's house and I don't know what it is about Grandma's that they have a certain smell. They all do. But even if it's just a person, somebody that you love who's gone, right? You ever had somebody who you love, they're gone, and like you find their shirt and you smell their shirt and you're like, and you're like, people are going, yes.
This week, and I linked to like 5 shirts.
5 shirts, see? Because we know, because it makes you feel better. Because it's like, it's kind of like he's here, and so I can make that serotonin rush happen. You're like, you know what, honey, I don't actually really need you anymore. I just need the shirts. So, anyway, that's all conditioning. So use it to your advantage, because it works. So, and smell is a great one. Okay, so let's see if we can kind of put these all together in one particular event. So let's say this guy needs a name. What name should we give this guy?
Jim.
Jim? Jim Bob. This is the South. So Jim Bob. Bubba Jim Bob. Okay, Bubba Jim Bob, actually no, he goes by James. Okay, so Jim Bob, he's working on a presentation for his job, and you can see he's sitting here. He's kind of old school. He's a little bit gray, so he's a little bit old school. He's got his paper and pen out. He's got his computer, and he's working on this presentation. Here's how all of these different types of long-term memory would kick in as part of this process. So first of all, his episodic memory. He remembers talking with his boss yesterday about the presentation he needs to do. He remembers sitting across from his boss, talking with his boss about what needed to happen, the kinds of things that needed to be in the presentation, what they know about the client, what, you know, that kind of. He remembers that from his own perspective. So that's his episodic memory. Okay. Semantic memory. Stuff he knows about how to use PowerPoint. Stuff he knows about the company and their products. Facts, figures, how to make a graph, all that kind of stuff that anybody could know. He just happens to know because that's his job. You think about implicit stuff. So, priming. In the meeting, they talked about a lot of different things, and maybe he took some notes, and as he looks at those notes, it reminds him of other things that they talked about, right? So it's easier for him to remember some things when he thinks of certain other facts that they talked about. So he's not intentionally, overtly thinking of those things that he suddenly remembers, but by kind of looking at some cues or thinking about one idea, it reminds him of another idea. Maybe he was thinking, oh yeah, you know, if I do that presentation, if I do this, I should do the graph like that. Well, that priming, where he kind of makes that leap in his head, that's an implicit memory. He didn't necessarily ever intend to make those connections, but he has made them. Now people are starting to feel scared. They're like, it's thunder, the power's going to go out, it's bad. No. Everyone's just thinking, I got to walk to my car.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to walk to my car. So everyone's developing this sense of dread. So now they're all going to associate long-term memory with dread. That's conditioning. Great. Okay, so procedural. He remembers how to type on the computer. He remembers how to handwrite things. Okay, so he knows how to do those physical things. That's procedural memory. And then conditioning. He's always felt a little bit nervous about giving presentations. He doesn't really know why. He doesn't remember that way back in elementary school, his friends told him that giving presentations was really hard and it was really scary, and he knew that his mom was nervous about giving presentations, and so he kind of learned that presentations make you scared, and people are looking at you, make you uncomfortable. But he always kind of feels a little bit nervous about presentations because he's conditioned to feel that way. Yes?
Just wondering about that. Most of the classes that I've taken here have normally had some kind of like presentation. Before the presentation, they always tell you that everyone hates it so much. Do you think that could be counterproductive?
Well, I mean, part of it is just acknowledging that sometimes there's stuff you have to do that's not super awesome. But I think that part of the reason people get really nervous during presentations is that when we know something's coming that we don't really want to do, we put it off and we put it off and we put it off. And when you put things off for a long time and you throw them together at the last minute, they're not as polished and as good as they could be. So then people get nervous because they get up there and they're like, this sucks. Or they think it sucks. They may not feel confident about their public speaking. So, I mean, it's one thing to acknowledge that an activity might be challenging and that sometimes students don't like it. But I think part of it is that when we ask students to do group presentations, we don't actually help them set up the building blocks to do them effectively. So we don't say, do this little part, do this little part, do this little part. So that by the time you get to where you're doing the presentation, you got this. If you're working really hard, you know, if you're trying to think about, how am I standing? What am I doing? Like, if you're not all just comfortable up there, then it's not going to flow smoothly, and yeah, you're going to feel uncomfortable. And you know, I stand up in front of people and talk all the time, so I don't think about it, whatever. Talking to you guys, that's easy, that's fun. I love to do that, that's my job. But next year, I have to give 2 talks on teaching, and one of them I have to give to my department, because I'm the teaching award winner for our department this year. I have to give a talk about pedagogy and how we should teach to our fantastic diverse student body. And then I have to go give a talk where I went to graduate school because I've been invited to give the annual lecture on teaching. And I'm like, I'm going to go back to my old professors, people who were my professors, the people who told me, who, like, I was in their class and I listened to this, and I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna tell them how to teach. And believe me, some of them need some. Because even in grad school, some people don't teach right. But I mean, I tell you, my conditioning is kicking in. The idea of getting up in front of these world famous professors at my grad school, because I went to a top 10, international top 10 program. To go stand in front of these people whose books I've read and whose articles I've read, whose research I've studied, whose research I've talked about in my own classes, and to have to tell them how to do their job because they've said, you're actually that good, we want you to come back and tell us what to do. And part of me's like going, yes. And part of me's going, so, everybody gets nervous about it, and it's hard for everybody, even if it's what you do every day. There's always going to be that circumstance. So if you're feeling nervous giving a presentation, just remember, everybody feels nervous, even people who do it all the time. It's good. It's not. Just don't feel like there's something wrong with you because you feel nervous. That adrenaline actually helps you. It makes you very sharp. You just don't want to let it overwhelm you to the point where your brain melts down and you can't think. And that takes practice.
Coupled with anxiety.
That's right. So I would say, work that smell. Be like, I smell fabulous, I look fabulous, and you just gotta come up with the casual way, like, yeah, that's it, right on the back of your head. Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. You gotta work it. That's practice. That's all procedural memory, where you don't even do it everything. Okay. So let's talk a little more about explicit memory. And I know we're not taking a break today, and that's because I want to make sure we actually get through this. Okay. Thanks to our very exciting technological challenges earlier today. All right, so explicit memory. Now, episodic memories and semantic memories aren't retained the same way. Episodic memories of learning are usually lost. So, for example, you won't remember sitting in that chair necessarily for every class you ever sat in, but you might remember the content that you learned in the class. You forget that personal experience to some degree because the personal experience of sitting in a classroom or the personal experience of learning something isn't always as important as what you learned. And so we will tend to focus on the semantic memories and retaining those semantic memories while the episodic memories tend to fade. We just don't rehearse them as much. We don't connect them as much to other things. They all kind of blur together. I mean, how many classes have you sat? How many classes have you had in this building in your undergrad career? Quite a few, right? And a lot of the buildings, all the rooms look kind of the same. Especially if you're sitting there, because the front of the room looks pretty much the same all around, right? There's not really a lot of distinction. So your personal experience isn't as meaningful or as important to retrieve as the semantic memories, which is the knowledge that you're trying to acquire while you're in that class. But it's true that semantic memory is improved when connected to episodic memory. So it's easier for you to remember facts if you can connect them to your own personal experience. So, for example, some elaborative rehearsal, a lot of it, involves making connections between concepts that you're trying to learn and experiences in your head that seem connected to them. So they could be totally arbitrary things, like, I'm trying to remember all of the planets. My very excellent mother just sent us 9 pizzas. Something like that. Well, that was how I would have learned it. Because back in the day, we had 9 planets. Now, there are 8. This happened in my daughter's lifetime. We lost a planet. But elaborative rehearsal can be anything that you do to try and give something meaning. Like, some people remember the great by creating the word Homes. Huron, Ontario, Michigan, something. I'm not from there. But there's different, I mean, I know you learn like the scales, you like FACE, every good boy does fine, right? You learn the different musical scales. If you're trying to remember different kinds of, long lists of things, you might make up words about them so that you can remember them. And those are all elaborative. You're trying to connect them to things that you know already. But most powerfully, the self-referencing effect. When you connect it to yourself, can you think of a time when you personally had an experience with that thing, with that concept? So, when I talk to you about covert attention, and I ask you to think about a time when you were walking in a place that was scary, and you were listening all around you, even though your eyes were straight ahead, you were listening carefully all around you for any potential threats to come out of the shadows. And I say that awareness of sounds and things behind you, that's covert attention. You're directing covert attention. So even though your eyes are looking forward, part of what you're mentally visualizing is what's happening around you. I'm getting you to reference yourself. I'm getting you to think about how this describes you, how this describes your experience. And when I do that, I give you the best shot of remembering that information, because nobody knows you better than you. And your memory is framed around you. So if you can connect what we're talking about to your experience, you can even get it, if you can say, does this describe me? Does this describe something I've done? Or can I describe something I've done this way? That self-referencing effect is one of the most powerful ways to get semantic information embedded in your head, because our episodic memories for ourselves are very, very strong, because nobody thinks about us more than us. We can improve our episodic memory by building up our semantic memory. So I'll give you an example from my life, because this is what's easy for me to remember. See if you can come up with one for your life. I am a super total geek. I'm a competitive cosplayer. I dress up in costumes, my daughter dresses up in costumes, and we compete and win. We're good. And I'm a nerd. I love going to Dragon Con, and I'm like looking at I see all the different costumes from all the different genres, all the different shows, all the different movies, all the different books, and I'm like, oh, that's Naruto, blah, blah, blah. Oh, that's Superman from this comic. That's, I know all this stuff. And I can tell you the fabrics that they're using, and I can tell you about, oh, yeah, that's the one that they bought off the rack. Oh, that one's handmade. I can tell because of blah, blah, blah. Because I know ridiculous amounts about costuming. Because I've been doing it for a long time. Now, I took my sister, also a professor, she teaches at the med school of Arizona. My sister doesn't even have a television. Okay? She doesn't read graphic novels. She doesn't read comic books. She doesn't really go to the movies. She teaches at a medical school. She spends all her time working. Or planting things in her organic garden in the commune where she lives. Doing yard work with her communal family. She has a very different life than my life. But she has kind of zero popular culture knowledge. She doesn't know who any of the popular bands are. She doesn't really know about any shows. She doesn't know anything. But she really wanted to come to Dragon Con, because she said, you always say that you're having in a given day at Dragon Con. Come back and my daughter would say, oh, who'd you see? Who'd you see? I'd be like, oh, it was so awesome. I saw somebody who was this from Battlestar Galactica, but the original. And then somebody who had done it, and they were doing it for this, but it was the new one. And they did this, and they had this. And I'm like going through all this stuff, and I can recite so many things that I saw because I have so much knowledge about that domain. Just semantic knowledge about different shows, different books, different comics, different graphic novels, different everything. Because that's my thing. And my sister says, she goes, so Aunt Diana, what'd you see? She says, it was very colorful. And a lot of people had big swords. And wigs. And really cool contact lenses. And she could not tell you a single character. She could not tell you anything about the fabrics they were working with. She couldn't tell you what show they came from or if it was from a book or whatever. All she could tell you was, oh, there was this elf. This really cool elf. And I'm just like, you're talking about the ones from Lord of the Rings, or you're talking about the ones from this, or you're talking about the ones from this? And she goes, I don't know, he was blonde. And I'm just like, okay, that could be this one or this one or this one. Was he wearing this or was he wearing this or was he wearing this? She's like, I don't remember. I think he had a bow and arrow. Right? So she just can't remember. Her episodic memory for what she saw is relatively limited because she just doesn't know any of that stuff. She just doesn't, it's not part of her domain. So if you ask somebody who's an expert in a particular area what they experienced at a certain point in time, they're going to be able to give you huge amounts of detail about their personal experience that a novice in that same situation would not be able to generate. And part of that is because with expertise comes the ability to chunk at short-term memory level. So I know exactly what L'Oreal's costume looks like, what it should look like, if you're being screen accurate. Which is very important for certain competition. All right, so if you're going to be screen accurate, then I know what the costume should look like, and that helps me remember details of a costume that I saw. My sister has no clue the difference between screen accurate or comic book accurate or book accurate. She doesn't know any of that stuff, so she just sees an elf. And she's like, they had a bow and arrow. And I think it was a girl. That's it, because that's her frame of reference. Yeah?
So what if the outfit looked identical to what you are accustomed to, what it is supposed to look like? Right. So
Elf 1, yes.
When you retrieve that information, like trying to explain to someone else, are you using your long-term memory?
Yeah.
Okay.
What I've done is I've taken that episodic memory and I'm able, because of my pre-existing top-down knowledge, that's influencing what I remembered. But I know when I look at it that that's the right costume, so then I don't have to store so many details about that. Whereas somebody who didn't know very much about it would have to store all the details individually and wouldn't be able to remember as much. Does that make sense? I can chunk because of my expertise. And this works the same way. Have you ever asked somebody who knows a lot about a certain sport what happened during a certain game? And they're like telling you play by play what happened, and you're like, I'm like, okay, so which team had the ball? Who won? I know like zero about the vast majority of sports. Like I can't watch a soccer match. I know nothing. I'm like, this is really boring. And my brother, who's been playing soccer his whole life and loves soccer, can watch World Cup all day long, and he's like so excited. It's so great. I'm like, they're just running around the field back and forth, back and forth. It's like watching tennis. So boring. See? Experts are like, no, it's fascinating when you know what to look for, right? Because then you see the nuance, the expertise, the detail. I'm like, whatever. Okay. So these two types of memory are interconnected, right? We can use them to help. We can use our episodic memory to improve our semantic memory. We can use our semantic memory to improve our episodic memory if we want to. When we talk about implicit memory, it's a lot harder to tap implicit memory, to figure out what's going on with it, because implicit memory is inherently memory that people don't even necessarily know they have. So one way that we study implicit memory is by studying people who have amnesia and looking to see if there are certain things that they can remember and certain things that they can't remember. And that helps us figure out if there are dissociations between different types of memory. It turns out that amnesia will affect explicit memory more than implicit memory. Memories that we don't know we have seem to be harder to lose. So even if you have severe amnesia, you can be conditioned. You can learn new conditioning. You can learn new primes. And you can learn new procedural memories. But you might have zero ability to learn new episodic memories or new semantic memories. So there's something about implicit memory and not having to rehearse it the same way that makes it harder to lose through amnesia. So, for example, here's an experiment that they did where they had people who had a disorder brought on by alcoholism. These individuals had been drinking very, very heavily for a very long period of time. And as a result, they had virtually no ability to form explicit memories, like literally. The doctor could walk in the door, talk to them, walk out, come back in 30 minutes later, and they would not remember that the doctor had been there at all. Now, individuals with this disorder were brought in to do a study. Well, actually, the researchers went into their hospital, and they started off showing them pictures like this. Now, that's a pretty thin picture. There's not a lot of detail there. And they would say, "Do you know what that is?" And they would say, "Nope, no idea what that is." They would say, "Okay, here's a little bit more detail. Can you tell me what that is now?" "Nope, don't know what it is yet." Then they would show them this picture, and this picture, and this picture, till eventually, they would say, "Oh, that's an airplane. I know what that is." They would get to whatever level of picture they needed to recognize. And they would go through picture after picture after picture after picture, showing them these images. And they would do this over the course of several days, 2 to 3 days. And the individuals were learning as they did this that, eventually, after you've done this with the same set of pictures enough times, you can imagine that eventually you'd look at this and go, "Oh, that's the airplane," right? Even if in the first you didn't know it, you could learn after going through the sequence enough times to recognize the objects with only a few fragments of line. Now, they did this over the course of 2 or 3 days, and what was fascinating was that the individuals made a lot of mistakes on the first day, but over the course of just 3 days, their errors dropped down to about 10%, being able to recognize the images in the drawings. But what was really interesting was that the individuals had zero memory of ever talking to the doctors, looking at any of these pictures before. They didn't remember looking at these day after day, practicing and practicing. No memory of that at all, but their errors were dropping, showing that they were actually learning how to recognize the pictures from the experience. So they were developing new implicit memories. They were getting conditioned to associate that set of lines with this word, or they were getting primed. I see these lines, that makes me think of that name very quickly. They were learning to do that, and they didn't remember doing it at all. So they had no explicit memory, not necessarily any new semantic memory, like I'm in an experiment. They didn't know any of that either, but they could do the task much more effectively. In your book, they talk about a technique called mirror drawing. And this technique involves procedural memory. I don't know if you've ever been able to do this. If you take this image, if you printed out this picture and you laid it down so that you can't see it, but you can see a mirror image of that, and you try to draw on paper, you try to trace this shape, but not looking at the shape, looking at a projection of the shape onto a mirror, you will be kind of bad at it at the beginning. Getting your hand to go where you want it to go. It's like, and this is something that not as many men have experience with as women, but women who have tried to do their hair in the mirror, right? If you like had to curl your hair or something in the mirror, and you're trying to get it to curl right, and you're like, it doesn't, you know, you're trying, and doing it, you're like, no, which way do I need to turn it? You know, like in the mirror, it's weird, right? Because it's kind of backwards from how you think it should look. And so doing the things you have to do with your hair is a problem. Not for me anymore. I just cut it all. It's like easier. But it can be quite challenging. But the more you do it, the easier it gets. And HM, the individual who had his hippocampus removed to stop epileptic seizures, he could learn to do this task. He could learn to do mirror drawing. And he had severe retrograde and anterograde amnesia. Now what's the difference? Retrograde amnesia is amnesia for things that happened before your accident. So retro is back, right? So if you imagine the point of the accident that induced your amnesia, whether it was a stroke or a surgery or car accident or whatever the incident was that induced your amnesia, anything that happened before the accident, if you can't remember those things, that's retrograde amnesia. It's what's behind you, okay, from that time of the event. That's different from anterograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is things that happen to you after the incident that induced your amnesia. So if, for example, you can't remember, you're in an accident and you wake up in the hospital and you don't know how you got there, you've got anterograde amnesia because you don't remember the accident or getting in an ambulance, talking to the people at the scene of the accident, getting wheeled into the emergency room. It's all gone. So since your accident, you don't remember anything until you suddenly get conscious again in the hospital. Maybe you've been talking to people the whole time, but you don't remember. That's anterograde amnesia. Now HM had terrible retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. He couldn't remember his own house. He couldn't remember his past. He couldn't form new long-term memories that he could talk about at all. But he could do this. Okay? He had horrible memory, just like Clive Weary. Really horrible memory for his past and the inability to form new memories. But he could do this. And so I would expect, for example, that Clive Weary could learn a new piece of music. He would just never know that he had learned it. So you could put new sheet music up and he would play it. He wouldn't know it. If you had him play that, you left that sheet music up and he played it over and over and over, pretty soon he'd be able to play that piece from memory and not ever know that he had learned a new piece of music. And HM could do this tracing task in a mirror extremely well, but had no memory whatsoever of ever learning how to do it or of ever having done the task before. So he could, one of the things they used to help him cope was they would walk him through and have him do the same things over and over and over. He would have no memory of ever doing it, but then he actually learned his ways around the house. And he learned, this is where the cups are, this is where the dishes are, this is where the silverware and stuff is. And he didn't know that he knew these things, he just had a sense that that's where they should be, and that's because they walked him through it over and over and over so he could make conditioning memories out of it, because that he could hold on to. But if you asked him where the glasses were in his house, he would have no clue. But if he got up to go get a glass for some reason, he would know exactly where to go because he was conditioned. Okay, does anybody have any questions about those things? Any of that stuff?